Introduce yourself.
Good afternoon. Do we need the lights off? No.
Oh.
No.
I feel like we need to do Shakespeare now, don't we?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jeff Jarvis from the City University of New York, Graduate School of Journalism. Why don't we start by asking each of our panelists to introduce themselves, and then I'll do a very brief spiel and we'll talk.
Great.
Jen.
All right. Hi, I'm Jennifer Brandel. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Hearken. We are an organization that serves newsrooms to help them better connect with the public throughout the process of reporting.
Hi, my name is Cristina Kim, and I'm the Engagement and Collaborations Manager at the Center for Investigative Reporting. We are based in the United States and California, and we are the oldest nonprofit investigative newsroom.
Hi, I'm Alison Gow from Trinity Mirror in the UK. Trinity Mirror owns national and regional newspapers and websites across the whole of the country, and I am their editor-in-chief for digital.
And I'm Lea Korsgaard. I'm a co-founder and editor-in-chief of Zetland, which is a Copenhagen-based digital newspaper that publish, in lack of a better word, slow news. And also I'm a former student of Jeff, which is very important.
I'm very proud to be a former teacher of Lea's. And I'm Jeff Jarvis, and I am delighted to be outnumbered. This is as it should be. So many years ago, when Mark Zuckerberg was still young, he was at an event at Davos where he was in a room filled like this with publishers and editors of powerful people. And one of the people in the room, the proprietor of a very powerful media entity, begged Zuckerberg, pleaded with him, and said, Mark, how can I get a community? We should be able to own a community. How do I start a community? Mark, tell me. To which Zuckerberg, a geek of few words, had a response of 2 words. You can't. Full stop, geeky stare. But he continued later and he said, you're asking the wrong question. He said, you don't make communities, you don't start communities. Communities already exist. The question you should be asking is, how do you help a community do what it wants to do better? And his prescription for this was a phrase that I still love, that you bring them elegant organization. And I think in its original iteration, at least, I think Facebook did that for the students of Harvard and then other universities and then the rest of us. And then we can discuss, but not now, please, because I'm outdone with Facebook discussion here. Yeah. But we can discuss, whether it does that now. But I think it certainly started there, and I think that is still its intention. Now, in the recent kerfuffles, Facebook said that they knew they'd kind of lost their way a bit, and they wanted to reset that back to that original vision by saying that they wanted to emphasize meaningful interactions between people. And that's what inspired this panel, because as I thought about that, I thought that that was not a sufficient definition of community. And I fear that if we think community is nothing but conversation, then we will shift from clickbait to conversation bait. Well, they talked about it. They engaged with our content. They engaged with our stuff. They engaged, and so our job is done here. That is an insufficient definition of community. Conversation is a fine thing, but it is an artifact of a community. It is an artifact of a relationship. It is a byproduct of those things. So what I wanted to ask from these smart people who are doing real and innovative and successful work in this field today is to define community. What is community? And I started a program at CUNY called Social Journalism with the brilliant Carrie Brown. And what we tell the student, I think one of our graduates is right there, Simon Galperin. And so Simon's heard this spiel. He's heard all of my spiels. But we send the students out in social journalism to a community that is self-defined. It is not sufficient to go to people as millennials, because no one introduces themselves in the street and says, hi, I'm a millennial. Or in the US, Hispanic, which is the label that Anglos give to people who speak the language they don't speak. What is a self-defined community? What makes a community? What brings them together? What are their needs? And then how do we serve that in journalism? So that's the setup to the discussion that I just want to let loose and come up with a better definition of a community that should guide both journalism and I think Facebook as well. And I've rethought my definition of journalism lately. I'll say this, then I'll finally shut up. where I believe it is our job in this time of polarization, which we help cause, and division, that we should convene communities into civil, informed, and productive conversation. And if it were just conversation, then we'd be back to where we are with having comments. But it's productive conversation, it's informed conversation, it's civil and decent, and it tries to accomplish something. So what should we help communities do? How do we do it? Jen.
I don't know that I have the answer. The thing that we're experimenting with at Hearken is really positioning newsrooms as the servant of existing communities. So not newsrooms trying to create a new community, but really being the servant of the information needs of the communities that already exist. So when I think about just trying to break these things down into manageable pieces, I think about citizens, so individuals, and then you get to communities, which are collections of individuals coming together for some common cause, and then you have institutions. And in order for democracy to work, those institutions have to serve the individuals and those communities. And so what I see the role of newsrooms being is to align their work with the work that's already happening, that citizens are doing, and the information needs that they have, and the information needs that that communities have. And so I'll give you a quick example of this. So one of the partners that we work with is in Chicago, WBEZ, a radio station, a series called Curious City, where they collect people's questions, which is really people's information gaps, saying, you know, what don't you know about Chicago that you'd like us to investigate? And a woman wanted to know, do Arab American Muslims and African American Muslims share mosques? And if not, why not? And she just wanted to know that to better understand the community she lived in. How does this work? And what happened was the newsroom convened a number of imams from different backgrounds to talk about this. They had a conversation, they recorded it, they produced it, they distributed it on their airwaves and online. And the imams ended up coming to the conclusion that no, we don't share this, and that's a problem. And so a couple weeks later, they all got together and said, you know what, we should talk about this with our communities, because that coming together of those imams started a bigger conversation. And then they asked the newsroom, could you facilitate a bigger conversation with our mosque groups together to talk about why we don't share our resources and why don't we come together? And to me, that is a perfect fit of a newsroom serving the community's needs rather than forcing a conversation to happen, and being there as a convener, a facilitator, an information provider, but not as I guess a colonialist, like we're going to create community now. So I just wanted to give that example. That's how I see newsrooms being able to serve communities.
Great. Well, I also think that communities exist and newsrooms are serving communities, and that's definitely what we do at CIR. But something that I'm thinking about as we're just discussing is that newsrooms also hail communities. So communities exist, but in the way that newsrooms and journalists address their imagined communities, they're reifying. Communities are constantly constructing themselves. It's a process. So I think we have to recognize as journalists, as newsrooms, that communities exist, but we, in the way that we address them and interpolate people and write things and distribute our news, are also creating that community. We're reifying ones that exist, and sometimes we are, just by the way that we hail them, creating them. So that's just one kind of meta, bigger idea that I'm just seeing. It's always a process. But at CIR, we also are in the service of what we call serving our impacted stakeholders. So story by story, we work with our editors, our audience team, and our reporters. They tell us what their investigations are about, and we identify what communities, who are the people who need to know this information, who are most impacted by what we're investigating, and how do we get that information to them in a way that makes sense. So the real questions that we always ask ourselves are, who is this for, and where are they getting their information needs, and how can we as a newsroom adapt to their needs and and how they're getting their information. We do that as like a myriad of ways. So we have a radio program that goes out to 500 public radio stations in the United States. We partner all the time with different newsrooms, with hyperlocals, with ethnic media, so Spanish language media, Vietnamese language media, in order to really reach people with the information that we're uncovering. We also do a lot of creative engagement. We have something called Storyworks. So when we did a big piece a few years back around strawberries and pesticide use, we really thought about where we were. We were in Oxnard, California. We were covering agriculture. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Teatro Campesino, But it was this really effective way of spreading the news in during the UFW and the grape boycotts. So we took something that made sense from that community, invited them in, and then spread the information that way. So we're just always thinking about where people are gathering and spreading information, and then really making sure that we distribute that information that way, but also invite them in to the conversation with us.
So as legacy mainstream media, which obviously our local and regional brands are, we're kind of having to relearn things as we learn community. We're having to relearn humbleness for a start, which is a fairly fundamental thing because we are so used to broadcasting and being the font of knowledge with our printed pages that nobody could kind of argue with in a public and visible forum. So that's an element. And then we're also having to learn conversation and listening. So the idea of hearing what people are saying, processing it, understanding it, then working out how we serve those people. And that might well be a community of interest. So examples of where we might do that is we had a neonatal baby hospital, special baby ward that was closing in part of Wales, and parents and mothers-to-be and fathers-to-be came together to try and save that. There was no point us starting a campaign off our own bat on that. They were already campaigning, so what we did was go to them and say, can we amplify you? And try and use our social tools and our digital expertise to do that. And that community came together, it saved the hospital, we supported them, and then it dispersed again. It was a transient community. Others are very permanent communities. They are the commuters who get in the car at 8 a.m. and at 5 a.m. and at 5 p.m. and they just want to know how do they get home quick. And that's a community we serve as well. So, and we're working as well with Hearken and Jen in Birmingham, which we can talk about more later. But that has been an incredible piece of discovery for us. So, yeah, we are still learning about communities all the time.
Do I get credit for making that introduction?
Oh, sure. The check's in the mail.
Okay, all right, good. I'm one of Jen's best salespeople.
Yes.
The other thing, Alison, just to add to your list, is I think that at a very simple level, we saw the community as a whole, the mass, right? The whole town, we call it community. All of our readers, we call it community. And in the stories you just told, no, the nuance of communities that form around a common purpose or interest or goal is different. Lea.
Yeah, but I would argue that I think that's true. You can, and that's a good idea to tap into a community that already exists or create smaller community in the community. But I would still argue, though, that what we have done at Zetland is to create a community of engaged readers or members, as we call them, that they are sick and tired of clickbait and breaking news cycles, and sign up to us to get informed and share knowledge in a club. Let's say, I like the word club, even though it tend to sound a little exclusive. You know, everyone can join the club, but it is a club, right? And so I totally agree with you, Jeff, that in our case, we like when people comment, but not just to comment. We like them to and engage them or ask them to contribute. You know, so we don't measure success in the number of comments, but in the quality of the comments. We ask them to help research our stories. We ask them for tips, for knowledge, for ideas. And so that's another way of measuring success than just getting the comment, right? Because a comment could be the F word, and that's not, you know.
It often is.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, now I still want to press you all, for the sake of new thinking journalists and for the platforms, to define the elements that make a real community. Give me some
I think knowledge sharing is part of it. That in a real community has to consist of more than two parts, namely a medium and an audience, right? A community is a group of engaged citizens One could be a journalist, and one could be a reader, but they all share knowledge in order to understand what's going on in society, and in order to enlighten each other. So I think knowledge sharing is at the core of a community, I guess.
Oh, yes. I was like, am I Chris? Yes, I am Chris. Well, something that I'm thinking about is, you said club, and I think sometimes in community, there's an insider and there's an outsider. And I think sometimes we use the word community to like somehow be all-inclusive. And I think we have to recognize that community means that there's an insider and there's an outsider. And when you are part of a community, what you're searching for is recognition, for someone to be speaking to you and to see you. So when you translate that into the newsroom, I think it's what you're saying, like you are looking to be talked to and spoken to, and you're looking to get something out of it. You're part of a community because you are being either affirmed and or receiving something that is useful to you that you can take back with you. But there is the word community in itself has borders. There are parameters. Yeah. It cannot include everyone. I think that's where it becomes a little interesting.
And I would add to that community is around affinity, and that might be over a shared motivation. So maybe they have a vision for how their neighborhood could be better, or a shared dissatisfaction of a problem that they see in the world. And that dissatisfaction might be, all of our kids are really rowdy on Saturday morning, so how do we create a community so that they can play together and we can get other things done? Or it could be around solving a water crisis or some other form of dissatisfaction. But ultimately, I feel like it's about problems or aspirations that people have an affinity for.
Yep, but it could also be, we're in a community in order to get fact-based intense discussion about society. We don't have to agree on everything, because I think that there's a risk there. That if we just define community as someone sharing more or less all values, then it's going to be a club that I don't want to be part of, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Alison?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. The idea that everybody within a community is working towards like a common and shared goal, it's a dangerous assumption to make. If you follow Manchester United or Manchester City, you are part of the football fan community. If you rock onto the Manchester Evening News website, you don't want to see your opposing team's information, and actually you might feel quite hostile towards not only the team fans, but also the brand that's associated with it. So there are definite ripples around how we conduct ourselves in the spaces of kind of particularly fan communities, where there's that kind of obsession level.
Right, and so that's the next level that I'd like to go to. I've been doing a lot of reading lately, trying to look at the notion of the mass, because I argue that what the internet kills, I've said this before here, is the mass media business model, thus mass media, don't you know, Alison? And thus the idea of the mass. And so what follows that? And so the first reflex is that people can now speak and thus find each other and gather together around interests, affinities, goals, passions, all these things we list, which I think is wonderful. But then to raise the second question, is there maybe the insider-outsider can become very dangerous, don't we know, right? And what's happening in the world right now, in a polarized world, which we helped polarize in media, let's be honest, is the lack of understanding, is the hostility. I've just read there's a Tom Edsall column in the New York Times last week that Jay Rosen linked to that is really wonderful, that in turn links to a few academic papers on people in the US. The fight between right and left, red and blue, is not so much ideological as it is identity and community against community. So that leads to the next question. How do we build bridges? That it's one thing to get people to be able to find each other, to say, yes, we are all young, soon-to-be parents who are worried about this hospital, and we're going to join together and we're going to do something across different interests, disagreeing with those who want to save on the taxes and get rid of the hospital, whatever. But then how do we tie people together across those bridges? How do what's our job? And then in turn, what is the platform's job, especially the social platforms, to build bridges? Is that our job? How do we do it?
I think so. I think, well, in terms of Zetland, I think our journalists, or I think upon Zetland as a host, we're a host in this club. And when you host a party, when you host something like this, you want people. We can and should disagree, but the host's job is to make sure that everyone is comfortable, right? And everyone is being heard, and you in the back, you're not left out, even though you're not quite sure what to say. You know, so I like that term. And just to make a or try to anyway, Sarah, who's our her beat is school. She's covering education, and in Denmark there's been an intense and traumatic discussion about public schools, and there's really these two parts that you can't just put them together. It's always an explosion. And she really sees herself as the person who wants to build a bridge between these two parties, and I like that.
So how does she do that?
Conversation is one part, and trying to explain for this party what this party actually means, and she says it out loud. She tells him, I'm Norway in Middle East. You're Middle East, right? And I'm Norway, trying to negotiate here. Or not negotiate, but illuminate if there's some way where we can get to talk to each other again in a sensible way. And I think just being clear about the role is helpful in itself.
Also bridge building?
Oh, sorry.
No, Karen.
Yeah, one of the things I just think about a lot is that as newsrooms are realizing that they need to listen better, they need to get as good at bringing in information and connecting people as they do to just pure distribution and production. I don't think they're staffed correctly for doing the kind of listening that would be required to build these bridges. I mean, there are exceptions. There are newsrooms like, especially startups like Zetland, ones that are building community around their identity, and their identity is, we are different from the normal news you get. We are something else. So you're bringing together a group around a lot of subjects, but around that shared connection. And I wonder that, to me, to build this bridge between parties who feel differently, you need to be great listeners. You need to create a space where people can feel vulnerable to connect with one another, and you need to have excellent facilitation. And I don't think most reporters or journalists are trained in that way, and while they might be seen as soft skills and maybe like easy, they are not. It's extremely nuanced. So
stay on that for a second.
Yeah.
And I don't know if Molly Diagiar or Jenny Choi from News Integrity Initiative are here, but they almost unilaterally declared this the year of listening.
Yeah.
Right, and you guys are involved in that, and we think that's incredibly important. That's the essence of social journalism's belief. So tell us, as a journalism school, how to teach those skills. What does that person need to be able to know how to do?
I honestly think that it would take people from outside of journalism to be bringing in their skill set. So whether that's, it might sound crazy, but therapists, people who work with folks who are on the fringes of society and help bring them into useful ways of being productive in the world. I think having people who are expert, even priests, religious figures, having people who are there to hold space in a non-judgmental way for folks to be able to share whatever their truth is, and to go deeper and feel that they're not being judged, or you're not writing down exactly what they're saying and you're going to tell the world. Like that's not a friendly environment to be vulnerable in, to be in front of a journalist. It can be hostile, in fact.
I feel like it's just not transactional. It's like moving away from like, this is my hypothesis, this is the quote I need to close this deal and wrap it up like a beautiful gift, and instead allow for the people to really share all their experiences, even if it doesn't confirm what you want. And I'm thinking about like, what are the skills you need to bring in? I mean, I think, anthropology, it's got a crazy past, but ethnography is so key because it makes you recognize yourself, the journalist, as a person that's inside of society, has a certain way that they're going to be perceived and has an identity, and that's part of what's going on. It's really this process.
There's a discipline of evidence there that we don't have as reporters. You're right, we just go out and get the quote.
Yeah.
So anthropologist I like. What else? Who else?
Well, and then I was just thinking, this isn't so much a person or a mode of methodology, but just more diversity in our newsrooms. We need more women, we need more people of color, we need people from immigrant backgrounds, we need people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, because if we're going to be conveners and facilitators and really allow for that, then we, again, going back to like that, who are we as reporters, we need to have different people in order to engage different communities and connect them.
Alison, you run newsrooms. What do you feel is missing, and how do we get there?
Yeah, I said this yesterday, so apologies if anybody heard me, but I don't think our newsrooms reflect well enough what the areas that they cover and the people who live in those areas, and that might be gender, or it might be colour, or it might be educational or age, you know, and that's where we need to be doing a lot more work, I think. Some of the most interesting people doing community work in our newsrooms aren't journalists, they're the content curators who manage the submitted copy that comes in, the photos from World Book Day that are submitted online, or the local grassroots football reports that come in. And a lot of those would have once been receptionists or kind of really people-facing jobs, and they have conversations that don't involve great political, intellectual debates that, you know, the political editor might have with their Twitter followers. They are just the authentic voice in the newsroom that most people come up against because they speak to them regularly and they maintain relationships.
Can I add something?
Please.
I think it has to do with reshaping the role of what is a journalist, right? Which also requires that you allocate your time and resources in a different way. So, for instance, Sarah, as I mentioned before, she doesn't spend all her time reading and reporting. Maybe half her time she spends in dialogue with the readers. That's half the time. That's pretty much, right? It's half her salary. I'm paying for her to engage with the members, but it's totally worth it. But it's just a different perception of what is a journalist. Right.
Right, we've heard that from De Correspondent as well, that they make that part of the job, and if you don't like that idea, you're not going to work here. It's not going to work.
Yeah.
Talk about that a little bit more, Lea, on how you arrived there, right? Because I remember that the goal of Zetland going way back was, if I may, tell me if I'm wrong here, but it was writers who wanted to write good stuff, good content that wasn't getting in the publications, and we couldn't do that elsewhere. So you had a content mindset at first.
Totally,
I think I may have...
You more or less took it out of me, I think.
Oh, good,
So it definitely
good, it worked.
It started in your class. No, I totally, I have to admit that I was born and raised in the old media. Content was an article, right? And your job was to make that content. But then partly from your class and just slowly realizing that, for instance, the mail I got, the email I got after I have written a story from a reader saying, this was a nice article, but maybe it could have been interesting if you had looked in that direction, or, you know, this is an interesting book for you to read. And I was like, that could have been nice to know beforehand, right? So how come I'm so keen on not revealing the stories I'm working on? It doesn't make sense if I'm telling the audience, the community, the readers, the members, what I'm working on, then I would get that email beforehand. So journalism gets better. So yeah, it definitely was a process for me.
And how did that tie into your business?
That notion is, Zetland is built on that notion. You know, do not be paranoid. Tell the community the stories. Tell them about the stories you're working on, because not to be nice, not to engage in nice dialogue, but to make better journalism.
So what am I missing here? What else have we not gone into? Then I want to shift a little bit into the platforms. But as journalists, what else do you see?
I think one of the big tensions I'm trying to resolve, and I don't have an answer, and I'd love to hear everybody's thoughts on it, is just, I think community is about depth. It's not about scale. And traditionally media has been about scale in order to be economically viable. So how do we make community about depth while there are newsrooms just disappearing day by day and layoffs happening? So you can only then serve a few communities really well versus more than that. So how do you make that decision? I don't know how you guys think about the depth of those relationships versus just as many.
It's a really interesting point, because the whole Facebook newsfeed is wrecked. Everybody open a group thing. You start a group, and some of them suddenly would have 1,000 members within like 3 days, and then you've got an expectation to meet, and you've got maybe 7 people in your newsroom, and somebody is having to maintain and look after and talk to and moderate that group and make sure that it remains a friendly and a nice environment for people to inhabit, otherwise it taints your brand. So the whole, how do we do this? We are still in discovery mode, I think is the best way to describe it. What we are trying to do, though, is the art of the possible. Just a few things well is so much better, and not trying to do as many things as possible to see what works. Let's just do a few things well.
What do we mean by depth, though? Like, I want to kind of, because I'm just, what does that mean? Does that mean that the people that we're serving are taking an action in some way? Like, how do we start to measure depth? Scale is so easy, it's really easy to measure, but I think what we're also going to need is a way to kind of quantify what is going to define depth for us. Like, what is a good enough relationship between the communities we want? And I don't have the answer to this, so it's something I want to discuss, because it's just, I don't know, I feel like it can get a little lost. I don't know what it would look like. And I think the way it's being defined now, and I think it's great, is that a strong and deep connection with our communities is that they're involved in our reporting. I think that's been the one that I'm hearing from you, and most certainly from you, and what we're trying to do at Reveal as well. We're trying to crowdsource and convene gatherings in which we actually record people in conversation with one another, and that sources our material. And so it's like this feedback, kind of a loop. But I wonder if there's any other way that we can define depth.
All right, so I'll push on that a little bit.
Yeah.
That's still fairly media-centric.
Yeah.
Right? And how do we flip that around so that it's truly community-centric? Right? How involved are our journalists in the community, and how comfortable are we doing that, and how? Right? How would the community measure our value to them? I guess is one way to look at it.
I'll tell you what, you used to hear a lot, and it certainly changed the way that we started approaching things, was you only show up on my road when X bad thing has happened. And that feedback really does make you think. And editors have tried really hard now to make sure that we are visible and actually covering things that are precious to the communities, geographic more than anything in this sense, but are precious to them, as opposed to, there's been a shooting at the end of your road, I wonder if I might talk to you.
Yeah, at a journalism school, when we started a dozen years ago, I originally headed up the interactive journalism program, and I quickly learned the paradox that we had no communities with whom to interact. Right? There was no one coming. I mean, our students would write stories and they got in publications, and we have a website where we put them up, but no one was waking up in the morning saying, I wonder what CUNY has to say today. I wonder what they can do for me today, right? So this is why you hear about teaching hospitals and things like that, which we can argue about at another panel another day. But how do you have a community to interact with? And I'm hearing a little bit of a theme here about the ongoing nature of the relationship.
Yeah.
So Reveal does amazing things for the stories that I tell about you all the time are the strawberry field story, for example. And you might think that being next to a strawberry field sounds beautiful and sylvan until the pesticides arrive. That's the issue.
Toxic gas.
And there are a lot of things that you do that still go to kind of a story and a need that might be temporal, and that's fine, right? How much do you see a relationship building with a community ongoing and meeting the next need and the next need you didn't anticipate? Is that part of your mission, or no?
I think that's what we're trying to get to, and I think this is something we were talking about before we even joined here, is that the Center for Investigative Reporting has been around for 41 years. So now to incorporate this new kind of desire to cultivate community in this real way, it's a pivot. We have to add it in. We have to imagine what it means to be a journalist, maybe more service-oriented instead of ego-oriented, right? So for us, like, we're still working on it. Right now, it is almost story per story. We're trying to identify the impacted stakeholders, i.e. community. But, you know, I think more and more we're trying to maintain those relationships, especially with our Silicon Valley series, which is coming out tomorrow. You know, we worked with women of color in tech, and that's an ongoing conversation. That's been going on for 4 months, and I can't see it ending beyond this story. I think it's going to continue because we brought them in a real way. Like, they were our experts. They're going to be on the radio. So in some ways, I think that will be ongoing. And that's story specific, but I think also our audience team is really starting to understand our audience as a community. And so we have something called Reveal Insiders, and we are continuously in contact with them. We're asking them what they think about our distribution. We're asking them what they think about the radio show, if they have any, you know, experts that they want to contribute to. And that's a closed Facebook group of like self-selected community members, and we're constantly talking to them.
Now, you both have what we used to call beats. Right, but that relationship changes, right? It's your education person is involved differently. Your community folks are involved differently. How is that structured now, and how should it be structured?
By help of the members, in the case of Sarah and her very engaged, it's almost like community in the community, right? By reaching out to maybe not the whole community, but those among the community who know something about your beat. I really subscribe to that idea.
There's a respect for expertise and knowledge.
Sure, yeah,
that's a starting point.
Yeah,
right?
and also that's why a comment is not. You have to. There's another metric for finding out. A comment is not just a comment. A comment is much more worth if it's the professor that is giving the perfect definition that Frederick is missing in his reporting or whatever. Not necessarily, you don't have to be a professor at all to comment, but yeah, using the members' knowledge and their backgrounds, and not just opinions. I think there's opinions everywhere, right? Opinion. We don't lack opinion. We lack fact-based knowledge.
Alison?
So we've got a new newsroom system and strategy that we're introducing across our regionals. Obviously, you helped enormously with that and came to Birmingham, thank you. And Jen, you're helping and ongoing in that. And the idea is actually to redefine what beats are. So like a health beat or an education beat is classic, actually. You have an education, I was an education correspondent. That actually starts from the age of about 3 until they leave university with a mound of debt. It's, you know, and nothing in there, like there is no common goal really there for parents. So it was looking at that beat and working out how do we break it down, and should, you know, the education of small children actually sit in families, because that's a part of it, or do we need different beats for education? And the reporters, using data, pitched to the editor to say, this is an important beat and this is why we should cover it, and these are the communities that we're trying to reach as part of that. And they had to demonstrate through metrics and data, including like census and demographics, how they would be reaching an audience of scale, and also an audience that would prize that information. So that's a completely different way, I think, that we have started looking at reaching communities and finding out how we can better serve them. That's not a finished process, as you know, and I'm hoping you'll come back.
If I can just add just a quick note, I think there's something to learn from the way the tech industry works, right? That constantly testing the product, constantly adapting and constantly iterating, and maybe journalism should work the same way, right? So when we launched this week a podcast, and it was tested beforehand on the members who wanted to participate in a working group, and so we didn't, you know, sit in the back of the office and then had this huge launch, and now came the new podcast product. But so yes, and that's so. I think actually there's something to learn from the tech guys in Silicon Valley, even though I know we don't like them.
Not all of us. No, I try to build bridges there. Speaking of bridges, I try to build bridges.
Yeah.
I want to go back to the metrics question, because Reveal has been a leader in trying to come up with measures to measure impact. Chalkbeat and, to an extent, ProPublica, I think, are there, but you've really been leaders there. But I hear you saying you want some new measures and some new ways to look at that. Right? It's a way that you look at the impact. Again, it's media-centric. It's what have we done and what did it do, which is good. That's fine. That's part of how you measure what you're successful. But this is different. How do you turn that around to get it before you do the work? Mm-hmm. How do you look at that at Reveal now?
Well, I think you're talking about the impact tracker, right? So we've been, so just for everyone, I've been talking about this a lot in this conference, but the way we measure impact is not about clicks or links on a page. We had the good fortune to have a research fellow with us named Dr. Lindsay Green-Barber, and she created a framework for us to really be able to understand the impact that our reporting, and again, that means our event series, our podcasts, our documentaries, everything, like the real outcomes that it has in the world. So she broke down this idea of impact, which just means the change in the status quo based on an intervention. That's all impact is, and that can mean anything. So in order to give us some tools for understanding it, she broke it down into essentially like a 3-tier scalar understanding of impact. The first is the micro level, and the way that we define it is if an individual emails one of our reporters and, you know, either acts as a source or, you know, says, my opinion changed on this topic based on your reporting. That's a micro level impact, and we make sure that we track it. The next level is meso. That's a change in the community. If this would be a meso environment. We're talking in a public space. It's a good conversation. We're all learning. And then finally, the macro level outcome of impact, which has long dominated what I think most investigative journalists perceived as impact. A law has changed. Someone is fired. We've held someone accountable. Good job. So I think what's really allowed us to do is see that there is no macro without micro, that we have to be attending to all these things and that they're constantly scaling up. In terms of how we're now like quantifying that into bringing people in beforehand, I think that we're still figuring that out, to be completely honest. Like,
so Jen, you make tools and methodologies to change how newsrooms think and operate. From your perspective, how do you see this challenge?
Well, so one of the things that we can't force newsrooms to do, but we encourage our partners to do, is to be in touch with the people whose questions they're answering and understand, did the people we're serving accomplish their goals? And that's something that you've written about, is being, what if that were the metric for news organizations? Are the people we're serving accomplishing their goals? And how do you know if they are? Well, first you need to know what their goals are, which means you have to ask them. You have to understand what it is, what are their information gaps, what are the things that they're looking for that you have 8+ hours a day to go find for them. And so what we do is we try and help our partners be in touch with the people who ask the question, not only at the very beginning to understand what are their information goals, but to circle back with them when they have the reporting and say, did I give you the information you needed to be a citizen in the world? And that, to me, also creates really great content for the final pieces as well, is hearing someone's reflections and their transformation of how they've changed when they hear new information as well. So that's a very micro level. But you know, if you do this all the time over and over again, you're going to help a lot of people accomplish their goals.
So now let's, one more question, then I'm going to come out into the room and you can...
Can I ask something really quickly?
Please do.
So I feel like a lot of the conversation we're having is about place-based newsrooms, right? Where the community, you know who you're serving. And I feel like one of our challenges, like listening to you talk about that, is like, well, we serve a nation.
Yeah.
And so like, how do we get that feedback unless we're digging in locally and like getting to survey? I don't know, like that's so interesting.
Yeah, I think you can still do it nationally. So even, we work with NPR, BBC, lots of big organizations, and you can still, whoever is asking you for that information, you can still circle back, and even if they're not physically with you on reporting, you can keep in touch with them, let them know what you're learning, share it with the world what you're learning, and see what other information needs you can achieve in the
communities cut across distances and,
yeah.
and cut across boundaries now, which is possible. That's exactly what the internet does. So it's, when I think of local now, I don't think of geography. Geography is one definer, but it could be, there's the great Clay Shirky story about Meetup. That Meetup, when it started, had to schedule all the meetups because they were starting, but then when they opened it up as a platform, as I remember, if I get this wrong, somebody's read his book, I'm sure, that the major trending group was witches. Because they couldn't find themselves before. They didn't have a way to have their coffee clutch, together, right? And now they could. And there was a community cut across God knows what. All right, so my next question is, we have Facebook and Twitter now worrying more about the quality of news in Facebook's case and the quality of the public conversation discourse in Twitter's case with their RFP, and I should give a full disclosure that the News Integrity Initiative is funded by Craig Newmark, Facebook, the Ford Foundation, and AppNexus. I'm independent of all of them and take no money from platforms, end of disclosure. Now, what do you wish that the platforms would do to help us in this holy cause of helping communities? How could Facebook be differently structured? How could Twitter be differently structured? How could comment platforms be differently structured? I've long said that comments are fundamentally insulting to the public because it says we want to hear you after we write the story, not before, right? So how would you imagine getting help from the platforms that do have relationships with people to help us serve communities better? Any wish list?
Maybe that's the hardest question.
That's why I saved it for last.
Yeah. Any of you guys? No.
I think on the comments thing, tying into Facebook, the thing that always drives me nuts is the snark under, we'll get, and it gets loads of likes because we're humans. Yeah, he's off. And that comment will get elevated above really interesting comments that kind of add to people's knowledge of the thing. So I would, and I don't do social media, like as a social media editor anymore, so I may, this may actually exist in the world, I don't know. But I wish there was some way of weighting comments so that actually valuable information and stuff that added to the sum of knowledge was praised above a funny gif.
But that needs some kind of editorship, right? And they don't want editorship, and it's difficult to imagine editorship on such a large scale, right? And maybe that's the fundamental problem, which is why I can't answer the question.
But maybe there's a goal. Part of the problem with comments is comments right now are comment on what I did, right? It's like we never got enough attention from our mothers and fathers, so now we want attention from everybody, right? Versus if there's a goal in mind and things that are relevant to that goal or are not, they are on target or not. Now, who sets that goal? In Jen's view, it's going to be the public that sets that goal. And in our view, in old media, our reflex would be to say we'll set the goal. But there's a goal to accomplish something. And then there's a measure against which the comment can be held.
Yeah.
I have a wish list for Google, so not Facebook or Twitter, but so when people need a piece of information, often they go to Google, and oftentimes they don't find what they're looking for, and then they're either stuck to try and figure it out themselves, and maybe they don't have the expertise or the time, or to go to a forum in which you can get information that may or may not be validated and fact-checked. So then what do? They probably give up. So what if Google could help port those questions that don't have good validated answers to newsrooms or news providers, whether or not they're local or topic-based, so that almost like a short-order cook, like newsrooms could be feeding the information needs that people are putting into Google or the search engines, so that we could make a more complete and accessible, validated body of knowledge.
All right. Questions, arguments, pleas, wishes. Anybody? Simon.
You're calling out your student.
Capitalism,
Simon.
It's the meanest thing you can do to anyone.
Well, he's mean to me. He was in my class. I know he always has an argument. From your social journalism work and perspective, and you're working with local sites and you're working with others, just how do you see community? How do you define community?
It's funny, I'm sitting next to my girlfriend Becky, who actually Googled the word community, which is a really interesting thing, because when you're in a room for a journalist, everyone's like, oh, well, I think community means this, and I think community means this, and somebody who's actually like a scientist and a researcher is like, I'm just going to look it up for you. Jeff taught me that communities define themselves, and I think I stick to that. No, I know. But I want to touch on this one thing you said at the beginning, which is nobody walks down the street and identifies themselves as a millennial. I have #millennial on my business card, on my personal business card. So I actively identify as that group, and because I identify as that group, I identify with it's an affinity for me. And I think that there was this conversation in the beginning around people don't identify around common issues and troubles, right? I think in the very beginning, like I'm a Manchester United fan. I have no interest in, I'm a football fan, so I have no interest in what other football fans are talking about. But we have, as humans who have a common interest, Manchester United can't exist, like fandom can't exist with opposing views, right?
Not with Man City.
Well, right? But I mean, right? We can't. Our communities can't exist without each other, right? Humans cannot exist without each other. That is what's so special about humanity. It's not that individuals were, as individuals we're so intelligent. It's our ability to connect with others, and like legacy media has for a long time made money on breaking apart communities and destroying those bridges. So I think this conversation is super important, but it's unfortunate that the audience in the room is so sparse, because this is the key to the future of not just our industry, but open society and democracy.
All right, so let me be unfair to the rest of the audience. Oh, okay, never mind. You may spare the audience. The people formerly known as the audience, as Jay Rosen says.
Really interesting conversation. Thank you so much. I am really interested in this idea of community, but I would like to hear what you have to say about how you build community in specialisms. I'm a science reporter. I report on science, environment, medicine, climate change. Technically speaking, I would call myself a foreign correspondent in the newsroom, because I travel the world doing these things, and it's not that I can genuinely meet my audience. But I'm very, very convinced that your approach is the correct one for my specialism. I'm trying to do a bunch of experiments in that area. How would you advise me to find my community? Because science kind of affects everybody. Health, journalism affects everybody. Everybody in this room is a community. But what would you do? Because it's almost too big a problem. It's I don't mean to say this in a bad way, but it's kind of easy to find a community that lives around you and talks about the issues around you. How do you find a scientific community talking about a subject which they probably never think about and make it relevant to them?
Is that to answer his question or the next?
Doesn't it depend on what you're going to use the community for? Maybe I missed something, but doesn't it depend if is the community the expert group of sources? Is it just an engaged readership, or so it depends? I would say.
Yeah. I was at a session earlier today. I snuck out of another one about publications around mental health. People who are writing publications about being depressed. Right? In medicine, it's fairly easy. I have prostate cancer, so I have shared interests with other people. It's different when you get to the Arctic. What would you do? Everybody should be concerned about that. And I'm not sure that necessarily is a single community as communities who may be involved.
Let me give you an example. So gene editing. It's a technology that has been developed in recent years that's going to allow us to do some fundamentally amazing things with our own genomes, with crops, food, everything. It affects everything. There's going to be some sort of public debate about it in the next few years, where regulators around the world are going to have to regulate this, and we need an informed public. So as a science reporter, I think I can write 100 articles about what gene editing is, and it will not penetrate really in any sort of educational, informative way.
I think to Leah's question, who
right.
are the decision makers that make a difference?
So my argument is, I can speak to the scientists. They're my community of people. I can speak to them, but they're not really my readers, if I'm honest. It's people who don't think about gene editing. How do I get to them? So one idea I had was to convene a bunch of people who've never heard about it and say, do you know what gene editing is? And then listen to them talking about it and see what their misunderstandings are, and do that. But I feel like that's just a spotlight in the darkness. Is there a better way of doing it than this? I feel like I don't know what I'm doing, frankly, on that front.
Well, I think that sounds great. Like, you're asking them, ask me a question about gene editing. I will answer the questions for you. I'll convene you into a conversation. But if you have, who is your audience? Because immediately I just want to break that down for you. Like, who do you want to reach? Is it children? And how are you writing it? Is it in a way that they're going to understand it and want to actually pick it up and keep on engaging with it?
I think what you're getting to here is, don't try to be everybody.
Yeah.
Find
Right?
some
Yeah.
singular group.
So find someone and then
Who
find
are
out what
they?
their interests are and touch those interests. Right?
You mentioned crops and food, so like, what are the organizations, you know, I don't know where you work, but in, you know, in your country or nearby who are interested in this, and make sure that they get a copy of it, even if it's just an email through like distribution that way. But if it's younger children, it's like, are you writing it in a way that's accessible to them? If it's an immigrant woman, again, how is it being written? Are you already presupposing a level of expertise? How do you have to frame it differently? Are there graphics? Are there image? Like, can you break it down into a tweet storm? Like, I think you have to think about who your audience is in order to, or who you want to reach, and then start thinking about the tactics to reach them.
You bring a really proper challenge to this, because this community way doesn't solve everything, right? Watchdog journalism, there's universal topics, there's other things that don't get solved that way, but I think, I salute you, we'll talk afterwards, about some ways to experiment with this for these broad interest areas. All right, there was another question here.
I think it's even more complex than this, isn't it? Because actually, I tip my hat to the idea that you can define yourself as one community, because I belong to about 10 or 12 communities. And in Birmingham, where I come from, the many different communities that are there are themselves divided into loads of different communities. So I think our problem is much more myriad than, in a sense, you're suggesting, because all of those ways in which you're suggesting we might move ahead, really great. I absolutely get that. And I would mention, though, by the way, we do teach listening to journalists. I was tweeting this, and a couple of quite angry tutors on courses in the UK said, what's the Italian for a word beginning with B? Because we do actually teach it. But listening's not enough when actually you've got so much information. How do you get through? You're essentially still going to be making some value judgments about, you know, which ones I go for, or which are the most important. And I think unless you have a diverse newsroom, you're going to still end up with the same decisions.
Okay, so just to your community, multi-community point, the exercise I was going to do that I'll spare you now is in class I often go around and I ask people, what community do you feel you're a member of? What communities do you feel you're a member of? What communities do you feel you're a member of? And it starts with the obvious. It starts with, I live in Queens, I'm a journalism student, I'm an immigrant. Someone in class will then say, people who are struggling with mental health. That changes the discussion profoundly, right? Because someone has now revealed themselves in a way. And that enables and licenses someone else to say, yes, same, or something equal. And then that is how communities form, is by revealing ourselves. That's what I'm very concerned about the reaction to social media right now, because if we shut down, if we all reject social media and reject this idea of sharing, then we reject the opportunity to reach out and find other people in communities like us. And then how do we serve them? So it was here and then there.
So I wanted to say thank you, because it's a very inspiring session, and also thank you for bringing so many women into a panel. I think this is great. And also not all of...
Amen to that, and these are the leaders who I come to all the time, because they teach me constantly, so they teach us all, and yes.
And I work as a community builder, like I've worked in it for a long time, and I agree with all of what you're saying, and I think it's just so hard to building engaging with a community takes so much work and time, and maybe will not be spectacular. So how do you advocate for like patience and sort of funding, and how do we build an ecosystem? I know it's like a very grand question, but I struggle with that. Like, it's very hard for me to explain to the people I work for that, like, listen, but it's not going to work this way, or it's not going to turn into that. And technology and social change, and then open data, and now like sort of new startup journalist scene in Poland.
That, oh my God, is such a crux. I think of this phrase, the tyranny of the quantifiable, and we are just totally, right now, and for forever, we've been tyrannized by what we can measure. And now that web metrics have come out, then it's all about consumption and looking at people as consumers and not whole human beings. Yeah. I mean, when I think about, like, how would you quantify a mother's love? And, like, if you can't quantify it, does that mean it doesn't matter? No, it's like the most fundamental thing for all of us. But we're not able to measure the things and then monetize the things we can't measure. So I think it's such a huge issue and problem, and I'd love to hear the wisdom of the room of how how you convince the people who have to look at the bottom line and the profit and loss sheet and how are we staying in business to say, we need to do this thing that is slow, that takes patience, that is messy, that will not always result in product that we can distribute in the world. I think that is the biggest question I struggle with. So I'm sorry I don't have an answer.
The thing we talk about all the time is how do you value a relationship?
Yeah.
That's what it really is. Anybody else?
In our case, it has to do also with retention. I mean, that's a metric, you know, that's a key data for us. Do people stick around in the club, right? That's important for us. But I really like your idea, you know, measuring the content of the feedback you get. If people write you, that's how I understand it. If people write to you, this changed my mind, it blew my mind, I'm a new
different type of measurement. I mean, it's trying to quantify exactly this relationship, because at the end of the day, like you're saying, we always have to prove something. We are at the mercy of like getting grants or getting subscription. Like that's a reality.
But how do you do it in practice? How do you measure that email in practice? You get.
We have a tool.
Yeah.
No, we do. It's called the Impact Tracker, and it's open source. And what we do is it's over time we start to see like the micro, the meso, the macro, and we can look at it in over 6 months, over a year, and we can make, you know, like pull out comments, and like the reporters are literally typing it in, and so then like people who make both editorial and development and fundraising decisions, like look into there and actually make.
Nice.
Yeah.
If I can just ever so quickly come back to what you said, which is I used to be an external assessor for a journalism college, and part of their coursework in the digital was to set up a community, if you like, build a community from nothing. And the ones that made a success of it were the ones that actually did the thing that they loved, and they kept doing it after the course had finished. So the vintage fashion community was really easy for that reporter to build and create, or actually create something that they would assemble around, because there was that common interest and you know, a shared love. And so I guess, I mean, when we call them beats, we also call them obsessions. So finding something and maybe starting off from that and applying the learnings from that to the things that maybe you're not quite as obsessed about is a way of learning how to do that.
Hi, I am a student in university, and I'm in a journalism 101 class. So that's why I'm here. And I know that me and a lot of the other students aren't really that engaged in the journalism or in like reading journalism or like keeping up with news. So how do you engage people in the community who aren't engaged?
That's a good question.
We have a mantra in our office that if it's our job to make it accessible for the things that are important and that we feel people should care about, and that might be council tax rises, or I won't say bin collections because everybody cares about bin collections, but the kind of the dry democracy-linked stories that don't do enormous numbers online. It's our job to work out how we tell those stories, either in a physical sense or how we present them, that makes it easy for people and accessible and perhaps doesn't drag their time but gets the information into them so they can use it for whatever they want without it being a here is an enormous piece of text or weighty like think piece that I need to read.
And I would add one more thing here is that it may not, sorry, I'm behind you. That's the common view of a media-centric, content-centric view is I wrote a great story, how do I get more people to read it? If you listen to what Reveal's talking about in impact, it's still media-centric, but it says, how does this have an impact on people's lives? If you turn it completely around and say, no, I listen to the community first, I understand their needs first, I have evidence of that first, to heck with you, editor, I know what they need because they told me, and I'm going to give that to them as a service, that changes the whole relationship. All right, then I'm going to come back here, then we'll be done. Yes.
So, how do you get the community to realize that you're changing that? Because if they're not engaged, like, how would they even know that's what you're trying to do? because they might be like, oh, they're just trying to get the story. Like, how are you going to change the perception of journalism?
Excellent point, right? If we think we're coming in and helicoptering in and exploiting their needs, right, then that's a real problem. If instead, we had a project at CUNY where we went in and did mold in public housing. Quick story, sorry, I'm going to go 4 minutes over, to hell with it. So they went in and they said, we're not going to just helicopter in for the story. We're going to help the community learn how to measure mold, how to remediate mold, how to complain about mold, how to find out, all these things, right? And the community leaders, they had to build the trust of the community leaders who were suspicious and said, you're just coming here just to use me. And then they said after a while, no, thank you. You didn't leave. You stayed. I appreciate that. But then very tellingly, one of the community leaders said, why did you pick mold? If you'd asked us, I would have put mold on my list, but probably number 5. I would have preferred to use this resource you gave us for the first 4. So what you do is it's not about starting with you and what you're doing, if I may be so bold, and you can come to the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism very soon, and I will brainwash you as Simon will tell you. It's about you having the confidence that you are observing and listening to the community and knowing their needs, and then they're going to have, then it's not a choice of whether they pay attention to you because you're serving their needs. You see? You turn it around. Okay, I'm going to go back here real quick.
Wait, I want to ask you a question.
Can I ask?
Oh, sorry. See you later.
Just a quick comment. I think you're raising a really relevant question, of course. It has to do with journalism's crisis, right? People exiting from journalism. And I think that, and Jeff, you're going to call me journalistic-centric now, but I think that journalism's crisis is not only about business models, it's also a crisis of style. You have to tell your stories in a tone of voice that aligns with the community. You can't, tell stories in a tone of voice that doesn't engage the community that you want to engage, right? So those two things has to be tightly aligned. And as I always say, no one today wants to listen to a journalist sounding like a church choir, I think. Maybe that's a wrong picture, but...
Not that there's anything wrong with church choirs, but your communities of another sort. All right, we're over 2 minutes. I'm going to get 2 more voices in, and then we'll be done. Here we go.
Corinne Podger, hi guys. I just wanted to turn it around slightly and ask if there's mileage perhaps, I know you've asked for suggestions, where the community creates the community. Okay, so as an example of this, I belong to a group that's interested in mobile technology, right? It was set up by a staffer at RTE. It was branded RTE, but all of the conversation that takes place in that group is completely open. The community is the community. That's what I'm saying. The work that then devolves upon the media organisation is extremely minimal, and the brand bonus is massive. So I just think we're thinking about this as we happy few have to serve these massive diverse communities, when in fact I'm not even saying they should do the work for us. I'm saying I think that there would be a hunger around many issues to be that service.
One last. I'm getting yelled at. Okay, so you're going to be really fast and then we're done. Okay.
Well, I just want to pick up on what was said before here, because I think there's an authenticity problem. Because we're all journalists and we're talking about communities, and these communities will have their own dynamics, their own aspirations, and whether we like it or not, they're going to want to take the stories on in the directions they want to take them. And the big difficulty that I've got is I want to be part of a community, but I'm only interested in the story, ultimately. I don't want to foster my story onto them, as we've just discussed here, but I am interested in them delivering me a story. Otherwise, it's just a support group. And, I'm not in the business of support groups, I'm in the business of journalism.
Well, this is where I will argue, if you're that, well, I'll be more provocative. We are not primarily storytellers. That is only one tool we have. We live to support communities, right? Any last word while I run back up?
Why are you a journalist? Why did you choose to become a journalist? Oh, sorry.
You have to stand up.
You have to stand up and tell us all.
Oh, okay.
It's like, it's fine.
Yeah. Sorry.
It's a perfectly valid question. I'm fascinated in stories, people's stories, and that's why I'm fascinated in your session. But I think that there's a dynamic issue here, because what we're talking about is getting closer to people and closer to communities, but we're also journalists. And essentially, there's always going to be a bit of space between our aspirations and their aspirations, no matter how much we organize ourselves and whatever function we bring to it and structure we bring to it. And I think there's always going to be that contradiction at the heart of what we're trying to do here.
But isn't the story a means to an end, not the end in itself?
Yeah, absolutely.
See, I'm a proud student of Jarvis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that tension is real. I know it exists at Reveal and at CIR. We don't want to be advocates. We're not trying to get a certain outcome, but I think that tension is a good one, and it can exist, and you can still practice these models that we're talking about and hold that tension, especially as the way that newsrooms look change. There are different roles in newsrooms now. There are audience and engagement teams and engagement reporters working alongside more traditional journalists, and I think that might be a good bridge.
All I wanted to do was say goodbye, and that's all right. I'm a microphone hog. I want to thank our all-star panel. I want to thank the panel as the room, and I wish we had another hour, but we don't, so enjoy the pasta. Thank you very much.
Thank you.